What I wanted to do is to briefly take you on a trail of that these extremist foreign fighters who went to Ukraine actually took. And I stress one thing, we're going to be talking about the two sides. So it's the extremist fighters from the extreme right wing who went to fight on either side. Here you have a snapshot from the video that we did with CEP recently, which was basically showing you the numbers of people moving towards the conflict zone. And obviously that gives you the magnitude of the scale of the foreign fighter mobilization. I just stress, not all of these individuals are extremists, but that's maybe for another discussion. I'll gladly just focus on the extremist side. So I'll be talking about 5 issues really quickly. So how they got there, because this is key. There is no case of, I'm going to take my BMW and I'm going to drive to Syria. There is no case I'm just going to jump on a bus in Sarajevo and I will go to Turkey. And then it's a bit more complicated, although people did drive cars there, like for real, if I could put it this way. Then there's the issue of finances, which is always, what makes it go round. Then there is the issue of the network. Was there a network behind it, either in the country of origin or in the conflict zone? The 4th issue is the arrival. The arrival, and especially connected to the 5th issue, clash with reality. Things on the ground looked a bit different for certain people, and sometimes it was a source of disappointment, embarrassment, farce, you name it. So I'll have it all for you. So let's get cracking. So the first thing, as I mentioned to you, it's the road to Ukraine. And I think the first question that we really have to ask ourselves is that, are they really going to Ukraine? Because majority of them were actually going to another country. They would be flying to Moscow. From Moscow, they would be taking bus, train, what have you, to Rostov, which is the closest, big Russian city closest to the Ukrainian border. And from there, things, would magically develop, I would put it this way. Sometimes the magic was really lacking, as I'll get to that in the later part of the presentation. But, they're not really going just to Ukraine. On the Ukrainian side, it was pretty straightforward. You would be flying into Kiev. From Kiev, from the Boryspil airport, you'd be going to downtown, essentially to the Maidan, where it all happened, where you could essentially walk into a recruitment office of certain volunteer battalions that would take you. And certain volunteer battalions, at least at the beginning of the conflict, would be open to taking on the foreigners. On the other side, it was just a bit more complicated. And here is the second point. The trailblazers have a draft. And indeed, they have a draft. They had a draft. As the foreign fighters, the extremist foreign fighters who were joining the separatist side of the conflict, they would basically be bumping into what I would call the Russian bureaucracy. And in certain cases, the Russian bureaucracy, for example, wouldn't have them. So if you are thinking Vladimir Putin is playing a 7D chess underwater with all the oligarchs of Russia and he's winning every game, you're wrong. Because Russia was unprepared for the arrivals of these extremists within its borders. And there were cases of individuals who were simply, well, how do I put it diplomatically, kicked out of Russia into the next neighboring country, which is, well, Ukraine. And then they actually had to travel through Ukraine to get to the conflict zone. The only problem was that they had to cross the front line to get to the part of the conflict zone they wanted. So that was pretty exciting for them, and I'll gladly tackle that in the Q&A later on. So to some extent, people say, it gets easier later, the trail is blazed, you can follow the footsteps of the leaders. Yes, it definitely gets later. There are segments of organization appearing. There are people who will pick you up, not only in Kiev for the Ukrainian side, but also in Rostov in Russia. Literally, I've seen messages on the social media where they would be saying, and I'm sorry, I'm going to quote directly, get your ass to Rostov. When you do, we'll take it from there. The only problem is that, actually getting to Rostov was the more complicated thing, and sometimes, way more expensive thing. So it was help, but the help was of a really dubious matter and then dubious character. Second issue is money. So who paid for it and how it was paid? So quite a popular, statement from some of the fighters that I interviewed. They would be saying, I'm a Westerner. I have some income from the West. I'm renting a flat of mine. I have an inheritance. And, my euro, my dollars, my British pounds, they go a long way in Ukraine. And certainly they go a longer way in Donetsk. So that's the kind of self-financing element. But it was, there is a bit of entrepreneur in all of these individuals. They did, experiment with crowdfunding. So they would usually fly themselves there and get themselves there, and they would be publishing, on social media. Not only they would have their blogs, some of them are still running, where they're simply asking for donations. The only problem is that if there is a bigger group and one is running the donation aspect and decides to embezzle the money and run away with the money to another country to spend it on, well, let's say, pleasures of life. And again, I'm very diplomatic, and this creates a bit of a, you know, tumult in the foreign fighter community as they want their money back. There isn't that much of it, yet the guy disappears, for example, to Montenegro, where he actually rents a nice place by the sea and enjoys himself. So that's a, you know, that's a tricky part. You know, trust was a commodity which was, you know, was lacking, so to speak, amongst them. The third issue is, you know, you could go there with a little help from your friends. And I've known individuals who basically traveled in some kind, and here is the BMW aspect coming in. They would be taking their cars, they would have organizations, local, for example, local Russian organizations, basically donating money to them, to making sure that they actually get from their country of origin to Donetsk, and sometimes in a really interesting, really interesting character forming caravans, as they would be saying, which was basically a caravan on a plane, but part of it was driven, etc., etc. I can get to that, but essentially there was a support out there on the ground. And that brings us to the next point, which is the networking element. Was there a network at home, and was there a network in the conflict zone? And to some extent, you could be saying that there was a bit of a network, a scattershot network in the conflict zone. You know, I've spoken to extremists who had belonged to extreme far right parties, and they would be saying that there was a Ukrainian party that they liaised with before the war in a kind of like, you know, fraternal way before the conflict, and they would utilize these contacts to actually get themselves to Kiev. Maybe not just to get themselves to Kiev, to land in Kiev and actually be picked up by someone. Because remember, we're dealing with a situation unlike Asya and Peter's presentations. They do not speak the local language. They're absolute, you know, people from another space, from another, from another universe. They don't speak either Ukrainian or Russian. They need this kind of guidance. They need this kind of support. Very few of them actually speak. If you're looking at the Westerners, very few actually speak Russian in this case. So they need this kind of support. Another venture was actually, you would be going through the humanitarians. So you would basically find an organization that was basically putting together an actual convoy, a humanitarian convoy, for example, starting from Moscow or starting from Rostov, going to Donetsk, which was financed by a foreign organization. And you would be liaising with these organizations, not only as covers, or maybe we wouldn't be saying that they abuse these organizations so much, but as kind of, on a fact-finding mission. So this organization would be telling the given fighter to what extent, what you should be doing, whom to look out for, whom to meet up with, and how and where. That was the kind of, the humanitarian organizations, for example, from France, Spain, Italy, they would be points of reference. They would be helping out. And the third point would be the beacons. So the guys who got there first, in certain cases, they would be getting there as early as late 2013. So even before the whole thing kicks off. And they are beacons. They set up their Facebook pages, they give interviews, they walk, they stand in front of the cameras, and they basically rope others in. And they are a point of reference for their comrades, for the other nationals from their countries, and for simply other people who want to go to the conflict zone. They are approachable. You can reach them quite easily. The next point, and here we get to the most interesting part in my view, is the arrival and the welcome. So the Ukrainian side, the volunteer battalions, were actually pretty determined to make the most of the skills of those foreign fighters that were coming in. They basically wanted individuals who had some military experience. And when they were coming in, they made the most of trying to accommodate them. How? The main thing was actually putting together squads of people, of fighters, Ukrainian fighters, who would also speak English. But if you're thinking there was a company, platoon, or a battalion like that, no. You're talking squads. You're talking 10, 12 people. Sometimes you're talking 3, 5 people. So one battalion, for example, would have Swedish demining experts. And they, of course, didn't speak Russian. They didn't speak Ukrainian. But they were attached to a unit or a group of Ukrainians who would be, translating for them, so to speak. And they worked together. So that was the degree to which they were doing. So Ukrainians were trying to make the most of it, really. Trying to not only get the numbers, but trying to get the skills and get them in place for those volunteer battalions. Now, on the other side, the situation is slightly different. If you're familiar with just a bit of Russian, even Hollywood style, you will know the word davai. Davai, which is basically in all Slavic languages, which means go on, come on, and then, just you're going to make it, essentially. But davai is sometimes a shortest summary for this very Russian attitude to life, which does not care about the, let's say, consequences of a certain action. And this is davai is what a French extremist foreign fighter said from his Russian instructor while fighting on the Donetsk separatist side, when they were sitting in a trench and they were ordered to attack a Ukrainian trench. which was pretty World War I, would put it this way. And this guy basically said, look, we're just going to go davai, and we're just going to run at them. We're just going to take this trench. Well, the moment he jumped out of this trench, the Russian, he was shot in the head by a Ukrainian sniper. And so much for the davai approach. You know, the foreign fighters on the pro-separatist side, they told me themselves they were appalled by the lack of professionalism, the kind of scattershot attitude, this really guerrilla-style militia approach to the war, which wasn't making the most of the enthusiasm, of the skill set, and of the preparedness of some of the extremist foreign fighters, or more broadly, foreign fighters who flocked to the pro-separatist side. And essentially, you know, the last story comes from the some of the volunteer militias on the Ukrainian side. They were basically, let's say, nationalist, and I'm putting it mildly. And there was a guy who arrived from the Austrian army, who said, I have military experience, please take me in. You know, I can teach you this and that. And really, you're talking to a volunteer battalion, which is basically looking like a ragtag bunch of individuals who really would need this kind of training and meeting with a guy who's Austrian and from the Austrian army. And even though this is an army of a neutral country, well, he wasn't accepted because he was half Tunisian and he was too black for them to be accepted into a nationalist unit. So that tells you the limitations upon arrival. You're expecting a red carpet. You're saying, I'm bringing my credentials, but the unit will not take you because of A, B, C, or D. Now, this leads me to basically one of the last points, clash with reality. There was a lot of clash with reality. I kind of discussed it, you know, for a moment with you before. But I think, you know, the fighters had really unrealistic expectations. I heard from many of the fighters when I was talking to them back in 2014, 15, 16, many were saying on the Ukrainian side, we're going to go to Donetsk. There's just going to be an offensive and we're just going to sweep the board and we're going to take Ukraine, you know, we're going to take Donetsk and we're just going to bring it back. It's easy. You know, it's a bunch of terrorists, the Donetsk people, as they would be referred to them, and we are just going to take Donetsk. On the other side, the pro-separatist foreign fighters were saying, you know, one more push, one good push, and we're in Kiev, and this house of cards, this funny little state, will just collapse, and we're going to be in Kiev, and, you know, it's all going to be part of this kind of broader Russia again. That's what they were saying. Then again, another clash with reality was when they were saying quite often, after some time actually spending there, that sometime in early 2015 to mid 2015, this ended, you know, the war of the maneuver ended. It became a war of the trenches, like literally World War I, and it still is to some extent. And they were saying, you know, there's nothing to do for us here. You know, we're sitting in a trench, anyone can do that. I'm not needed, I'm not contributing. This conflict is not contributing to my self-development, if I can put it this way. So I'll just leave. Many of them were actually saying this. And probably the last story is the most extreme. An extremist foreign fighter coming from the far left, actually, you know, so a nice, change at the very end from Spain, who is far left, of course, hates American imperialism, hates NATO, joins the pro-separatist militia to fight, as he told me, you know, the NATO forces aligned on the Ukrainian side. And then he comes back and he was so disillusioned that he says, I'm sick of this, you know, I'm for NATO now. You know, it was so bad out there that, you know, my expectations were so different that I'm actually now a transatlantic guy. You know, I want NATO to actually go into Ukraine and sort it out. But I believe there was no NATO there. So, you know, I was completely fooled by this whole picture. So that, you know, maybe with this, I'm partly wrapping it up with this, but I'll just, last point, on the recruiters. If you do the recruiters, were they recruiters? And I think this is the last point. Yes, they do. They did through Facebook pages, right, left, and center, like I mentioned to you, through Messenger. Essentially, the Messenger was the place where you would be sending your CV. And these guys would be checking out your CV via Messenger and checking whether you would be good to contribute to the war effort, whether you had experience, whether you had the relevant experience to join a given unit that was hosting extremist foreign fighters. And they would be using media appearances to actually pontificate about how great this was. And many of them actually, when they were unhappy, they were saying, look, I won't do any more interviews. If you still keep me in the reserve, I want to fight. And, you know, it was like they wanted a quick quid pro quo. I'll give you the interviews. You can show my face. I'm going to rope others in, but allow me to fight. And in many instances, especially on the separatist side, that wasn't possible. And I'll leave you with this. Asya and Pieter were talking about fighters who were traveling to a conflict zone, and they were mostly doing it in a clandestine fashion. Because at some stage, planning even to go was illegal. Here, it was mostly, and in the main, legal. And up until this day, coming back, going and coming back, it's still legal. So that kind of changes our discussion on the afterlives of these fighters. And we will be probably hosting more events on that. I'll slip the cat out of the backhands here, and I'll stop here.